Right now, you're absolutely certain about at least 3 things that never happened. And school taught you every one of them. We're not talking about conspiracy theories. We're talking about facts that millions of people still believe because that's what they were taught. Think of Walt Disney. Forget the cryogenic chamber. His death certificate sums it up in a single line. He was cremated 2 days after his death. Picture the Salem witches. Do you see crowds and bonfires? Open the court records from 1692 and the fire disappears. Not a single person was burned. They were killed by the cold, methodical bureaucracy of the noose and the stone. Today, we'll debunk 27 historical myths and reveal the exact document that shatters them. You still believe many of them to this day. Let's begin. Number 1. The deed that handed away an empire. For 1,000 years, the most powerful institution in Europe held a piece of parchment that said the Roman Emperor Constantine had personally, gratefully, signed over rule of the entire Western Empire to the Pope. Rome, Italy, the lot. It was called the Donation of Constantine, and popes cited it to kings the way you'd cite a receipt. Nobody in power wanted to check it, because everybody in power was using it. Then in 1440, a scholar named Lorenzo Valla did something almost nobody had thought to do. He read it closely, not for what it claimed, for how it was written. The Latin was wrong. It used words that didn't exist in Constantine's 4th century, described titles invented centuries later, referred to Constantinople as a place of honor before the city had even been founded under that name. A forger writing centuries after Constantine had given himself away by his own vocabulary, the way a con artist trips over a word that hadn't been coined yet. Valla didn't need a battlefield. He needed grammar. It helped that he was working under a king who happened to be feuding with the papacy, so he had cover to say out loud what quieter scholars had only suspected. The most consequential land grant in medieval history turned out to be fan fiction, and it took one man willing to be unpopular to notice that the emperor was writing in a dialect he could never have spoken. The deed had been sitting in the open for 1,000 years. Nobody had simply read it like a text before. Number 2. The face that was already gone. Everyone has the story ready. Napoleon's soldiers, in Egypt, bored and cruel, use the Great Sphinx for target practice and blow its nose clean off. It's tidy. It gives you a villain. It's also impossible, and the proof was drawn 60 years before Napoleon was old enough to command anyone. A Danish naval captain named Frederick Louis Norden traveled up the Nile in 1737, sketching everything he saw with an engineer's patience. His drawings of the Sphinx, published in 1755, show the same flat, ruined space where the nose should be. Napoleon wasn't born until 1769. You cannot shoot off something that vanished before you existed. Medieval Arab writers had already blamed a 14th century zealot with a chisel, angry at locals leaving offerings at the statue's feet. The cannonball version won anyway, because a bored soldier is a better story than a devout man with a grudge. Norden's sketch had the answer the whole time. It just wasn't dramatic enough to beat the lie. Number 3. The frozen man who was ashes. Walt Disney had himself cryogenically frozen, they say, waiting under Disneyland to be thawed in a better future. It's such a good rumor that a whole conspiracy grew up around it. His actual death certificate ends it in one line. Disney died in December 1966, and the document records that he was cremated 2 days later, his ashes interred at Forest Lawn in Glendale. There was no freezing, and the timeline makes it almost impossible. The very first human being ever placed in cryonic suspension anywhere on Earth went under about a month after Disney died, in January 1967. When the legend says Walt was frozen, it's describing a procedure that had not been performed on a single person yet at the moment his ashes were already sitting in an urn. Even the head of the one cryonics group operating then said plainly, years later, that Disney was cremated and that he'd seen the ashes himself. The man who sold the future better than anyone got buried in the most ordinary way there is, and we couldn't stand it, so we froze him ourselves, in a story. Number 4. The noodles that never left China. Here is a fact so comfortable you've probably repeated it. Marco Polo went to China, ate noodles, and brought pasta home to Italy. It's charming. It's the kind of thing that sounds like it must be true. It fell apart the moment anyone looked at a Genoese estate record from 1279. A soldier's will from that year 16 years before Polo even got back from Asia, lists among the man's possessions a small basket full of macaroni. Italians were already inventorying pasta, valuing it, leaving it to their heirs, while Polo was still on the road. So, where did the myth come from? Not from history. From a 1920s American trade magazine called the Macaroni Journal, which printed the Marco Polo tale as a bit of promotional flavor and watched it harden into common knowledge. A pasta advert wrote a chapter of Italian history, and we filed it next to the real ones without checking the date on the will. Number 5. The apple that never touched his head. Picture it, because you've been trained to. Isaac Newton under a tree, an apple drops. It bonks him on the skull, and gravity arrives like a cartoon light bulb. Almost none of that survives contact with the only first-hand source we have. In 1752, an antiquarian named William Stukely wrote down what Newton himself had told him, over tea, in a garden, under those very apple trees. Newton said he watched an apple fall, straight down, and it made him wonder why it always fell toward the center of the earth and never sideways. That's it. A falling apple, seen, not felt. No blow to the head, no instant revelation, just a careful man noticing an ordinary thing and refusing to let it go. Stukely's memoir sat in the Royal Society's archive, saying so plainly. We swapped the real story, a mind that paid attention, for a slapstick version where the universe hits a genius on the head, because the second one lets the rest of us off the hook. Number 6. The emperor who wasn't there. So why does everyone still say Nero fiddled while Rome burned? 2 problems, and the older one is fatal. The fiddle, the bowed violin, wouldn't be invented for roughly 1500 years, so whatever Nero was doing, it wasn't that. But the deeper answer sits in Tacitus, a Roman historian with no love for Nero at all, writing within living memory of the fire in his annals. Tacitus says Nero was 35 miles away at Antium when the flames started, that he rushed back, threw open his own gardens and public buildings to the homeless, and organized relief. Tacitus even records the rumor that Nero sang about the fall of Troy while the city burned, and he records it as exactly that, a rumor, the kind that clings to a man people already hate. Here is what gets me about it. We took the one moment the record shows him behaving decently and turned it into the image of his cruelty. A tyrant can be guilty of plenty and still be innocent of the specific thing you were taught. History remembers what people did. It also remembers what we found it convenient to say they did, and over the centuries the second record tends to get louder than the first. Number 7. The flag nobody saw her sew. Since we're standing in the schoolroom, here's another one from the wall. Betsy Ross, Philadelphia seamstress, stitches the first American flag at George Washington's personal request. You can visit the house. There's a plaque. What there isn't, anywhere, is a single record of it from her lifetime. No letter, no ledger, no minute of any flag committee, nothing from Washington, nothing from Ross herself, who lived until 1836 and never once claimed the honor in writing. The story arrives in 1870, 94 years after the supposed event, when her grandson William Canby stood up at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and told it as a family memory. He was 11 when his grandmother died. That's the entire foundation, a fond recollection, delivered to a room on the eve of the nation's centennial, when America was hungry for exactly this kind of tidy founding scene. Betsy Ross was real, and she really sewed flags. The famous flag is a grandson's affectionate guess that everyone agreed to stop questioning. Number 8. The extra finger that killed a queen twice. Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers on one hand. You've heard it, maybe seen it dramatized. The little mark of the witch, the hint that Henry VIII's second wife was somehow wrong in her body. No one who actually met her ever wrote it down. It appears for the first time in 1585, half a century after her execution, in a book by Nicholas Sander, a Catholic exile whose entire purpose was to destroy the reputation of Anne's daughter, Queen Elizabeth. Give the mother a witch's deformity and you taint the throne of the heretic child. It was propaganda with a body attached, and Sander didn't stop at the finger. He loaded her with a jutting tooth and a growth on her neck, the full medieval costume of a witch. When Anne's remains were finally examined during restoration work in the 1870s, there was no 6th finger, no claw, nothing but the bones of an ordinary woman who lost a court fight to a king who wanted a different wife. Henry's court, executed her once. Sanders' book executed her a second time, on paper, and that second killing is the one that stuck. We remember the invented hand and forget the real neck. Quick gut check before the next stretch, because 8 of these are behind us, and I'm curious. Which one, honestly, would you have bet money on this morning? Not, which was interesting, everyone says all of them. Pick the single fact you'd have defended out loud, the one that just quietly fell over. Put it in the comments and tell me what tipped you. I actually read them, and the answers to this question are always better than the video. Number 9. The president whose only fame was invented. On a slow day in 1917, with a world war on and nothing lighter to write about, an American journalist named H.L. Mencken sat down and made something up for fun. He published a solemn little history of the bathtub in a New York paper, full of confident dates and fake laws, and claimed that President Millard Fillmore had installed the first bathtub in the White House and made bathing respectable in America. Every word of it was invented, and Mencken later called it a tissue of deliberate absurdities. He thought the joke was obvious. It wasn't. Newspapers reprinted it as fact. Reference books absorbed it. Doctors cited it in medical journals to show how far public hygiene had come. When Mencken finally confessed the whole thing was a fabrication, the confession barely slowed it down, and some papers printed his admission and then went on repeating the hoax anyway. To this day, the one thing many people know about Millard Fillmore is a bathtub that a bored writer dreamed up on deadline to fill a column, a man's entire place in history, handed to him as a joke, and kept by a public that liked the joke better than the truth. Number 10. The ear. And which part was the lie? You know the painting. You know the bandage. The question is, how much was under it? For a century, the polite, forgivable version held. Vincent van Gogh, in a breakdown, cut off a small piece of one earlobe, a tidy tragedy. In 2016, a researcher named Bernadette Murphy tracked down a document that had been sitting, folded and overlooked, in an American library. It was a drawing made by Dr. Felix Ray, the young physician who treated Van Gogh that night in Arles in 1888, sketched on a prescription slip. The diagram shows a clean line across the base of the ear, not the lobe. Almost the whole thing, taken off with a razor, leaving only a sliver. The gentle version we'd all agreed on was the comforting one, the one that let us look. Ray's little sketch is harder and truer, and it reminds you that sometimes the myth isn't invented to make history exciting. Sometimes it's invented to make it bearable. Number 11. The room that never held a single sick Roman. Let's set the darkness down for a moment and talk about a word. The Vomitorium. You've heard the story. Decadent Romans, gorging at feasts, retreating to a special room to be sick so they could return and eat more. It's the single most repeated image of Roman excess, and it's built on a mistranslation of a piece of architecture. In the writings of Macrobius and in Roman usage, a vomitorium was simply a passageway in an amphitheater, the wide exit through which a packed crowd would spew out into the streets after the games. The word describes people pouring out of a stadium, not dinner coming back up. Rome had plenty of real decadence to answer for. This particular one is a grammar mistake wearing a toga, and we've been dining out on it for centuries. Number 12. The horse who was almost a senator. The mad emperor Caligula made his horse a consul. It's the go-to shorthand for power gone insane, and it comes from a single line in Suetonius, a biographer writing decades later, who says only that Caligula was said to have intended to make his beloved horse Incitatus a consul, was said to have intended. That's the whole beam holding up the story. And Suetonius, like most who wrote about Caligula, came from the senatorial class the emperor had spent his reign humiliating. Read it that way, and it stops sounding like madness and starts sounding like a threat with a punchline, a ruler telling the Senate that his horse could do their job about as well as they could. We took a tyrant's insult to his own government, an ancient bit of savage comedy, and mounted it in the Museum of Insanity. The cruelest thing Caligula may have done to the Senate was be funny about it. Number 13. The general who never threw a ball. Abner Doubleday. The name is baked into baseball. It's why the Hall of Fame sits in Cooperstown. And Doubleday, a real Civil War general who left behind detailed diaries and dozens of letters, mentioned baseball in exactly none of them. The credit comes from a commission assembled in the early 1900s by a sporting goods magnate who wanted, badly, for baseball to be a purely American invention with no debt to English games. The commission went looking for a founder and settled on the testimony of one elderly man, in one letter, recalling a scene from 1839. In 1839, Doubleday was a cadet at West Point, with no record of ever being in Cooperstown that summer. There's a detail that turns the whole thing from careless to almost absurd. The man whose single letter founded the legend was, by 1839, about 5 years old, and he would end his own life in an asylum. The Commission's final report, dated December 1907, enshrined the story anyway, because the country wanted a clean American origin more than it wanted an accurate one, and that is why the Hall of Fame sits where it sits. Here's the irony that outlives the man. Doubleday did more than enough in his real life, a general at Gettysburg, to be remembered, and instead he's immortal for the one thing he demonstrably never did. Number 14. The Countess and the Bath of Blood. A Hungarian countess named Elizabeth Bathory murders young women and bathes in their blood to stay young. It is the most durable image of female evil in European folklore, and the bath never appears in the record of her own case. Bathory died in 1614. The blood-bathing first shows up in print in 1729, more than a century later, in a lurid history written by a Jesuit named Laszlo Torocci. The testimony gathered during her actual prosecution, which surfaced and was published later, is grim enough, but it contains no mention of bloodbaths at all. That detail was added by a storyteller, in an age obsessed with vampires, who understood that a woman who kills for power is frightening but a woman who kills for beauty is legible. Whatever Bathory did or didn't do, and even that is now argued over, the bath is a later author's flourish. It says less about her vanity than about how badly the men writing history needed a woman's cruelty to be about her looks. Number 15. The tower he probably never climbed. Did Galileo really drop 2 balls off the Leaning Tower of Pisa to prove they'd land together? It's in every physics class as the moment theory met the real world. It rests on one source, and it's a shaky one. The only account of the tower experiment comes from Vincenzo Viviani, Galileo's devoted young assistant, who wrote his master's biography decades after the fact and published it in the 1700s, long after Galileo's death. No contemporary record mentions it. Galileo himself, who wrote about falling bodies at length and was not shy about his own triumphs, never described dropping anything off that tower. The demonstration Galileo actually used was quieter and cleverer, rolling balls down inclined ramps to slow gravity down enough to measure. The tower is a biographer's flourish, a good scene added by an admirer. The real experiment was patient and unglamorous, which is usually how the real ones are. Number 16. The Rider Who Whispered. The British are coming, Paul Revere, galloping through the night, shouting it to wake the countryside. Skip the shouting because Revere himself told the story differently, in his own words, in a deposition he wrote in 1798 for the Massachusetts Historical Society. He describes a careful, secretive ride. He wouldn't have bellowed, "The British are coming," partly because the mission depended on stealth, with British patrols on the roads, and partly because the colonists still thought of themselves as British. The warning he actually carried was closer to, "The regulars are coming out." He was one of several riders that night, not a lone hero, and he was captured before he ever reached Concord. The document in his own hand corrects a poem that arrived nearly a century later and rewrote the evening into a solo cavalry charge. The truth is a nervous man moving quietly in the dark, which is somehow braver than the version that shouts. Number 17. The Mind We Turned into a Face. Picture Cleopatra, and you picture a face. The most beautiful woman in the ancient world, the face that toppled Caesar and then Mark Antony. The people closest to the sources tell it differently, and it's the better story. Plutarch, drawing on older accounts, states plainly that her beauty on its own was not the kind that stopped a room. What was irresistible, he says, was her presence, her wit, the sound of her voice, her command of language after language, the sheer intelligence of her company. Then look at the coins minted under her own authority, her own approved likeness, and you find a strong, sharp, unmistakably real profile with a prominent nose, nothing like the soft ideal Hollywood later handed her. She was a ruler who held Egypt independent against Rome at the height of its power. who by ancient account could speak with envoys from nearly a dozen nations in their own tongues without an interpreter. And we reduced all of it to a pretty face, because a brilliant queen is harder to file away than a beautiful one. We took one of the ancient world's sharpest minds and flattened her into a portrait. If you've read this far into the paperwork with me, you're my kind of person. And there's a lot more of this on the channel, the whole habit of pulling the receipt on things everyone assumes. Subscribe if you want the next one to find you. We don't post constantly. When we do, it's because we found a paper trail worth walking down. Number 18. The missing link that was glued together. For 40 years, the fossil that supposedly proved humans evolved from apes sat in the British Museum, celebrated, studied, taught. It was called Piltdown Man, dug from an English gravel pit in 1912. A skull that looked human paired with a jaw that looked ape, exactly the in-between creature science was hoping to find. It fit the theory so neatly that hardly anyone pushed on it. It even got a proper scientific name, Eoanthropus dawsoni, Dawson's Dawn Man, after the amateur who found it. Then, in 1953, a team of researchers finally ran the newer chemical tests, and the whole thing dissolved in a matter of weeks. The jaw belonged to an orangutan. The teeth had been filed down by hand to fake the flat wear of a human bite. The bones had been stained a matching brown to counterfeit their age. Someone had assembled the missing link at a workbench and salted it into an English gravel pit for the experts to dig up and celebrate. It's the most successful scientific hoax on record, and its lesson isn't that experts are fools. It's that a fake fits fastest when it tells you exactly what you were already hoping to hear. Number 19. The peeper who arrived 6 centuries late. Ride with me back to 11th century Coventry, and the legend of Lady Godiva, who rode naked through town to protest her husband's cruel taxes while every citizen, out of respect, looked away. Every citizen except one, Peeping Tom, the tailor who couldn't resist a glance and was struck blind for it. Here's the seam in the story. Godiva was a real noblewoman, well documented in charters and land grants. The naked ride first appears in a chronicle by Roger of Wendover written around 2 centuries after she lived, already shaky. But Peeping Tom isn't in that version, or any medieval version. He doesn't show up for another 400 years, first surfacing in Coventry's own records in the 1600s and 1700s. The most memorable character in the whole legend, the one whose name we still use for a voyeur, was bolted onto the tale roughly 7 centuries after the fact. The lie has a lie inside it, and the inner one is the part everybody remembers. Number 20. The theorem that was ancient when Pythagoras was born. A small clay tablet in a collection at Columbia University quietly embarrasses one of the most famous names in mathematics. It's called Plimpton 322, and it was written in Babylon somewhere around 1800 BC. On it, in wedge-shaped script, is a neat table of numbers, and those numbers are what we'd now call Pythagorean triples, the exact whole number relationships of right triangles that Pythagoras supposedly discovered. Except the tablet predates Pythagoras by more than 1,000 years, the Babylonians were working fluently with these relationships, while the man who'd get the credit was still a millennium from being born. We hang a whole idea on a single Greek name because a single name is easy to teach and easy to remember. The truth is slower and more humbling. Knowledge rarely has one father. It usually has a long line of forgotten people, working in the right direction, whose clay outlasted their names. Number 21. The bulb he improved, not invented. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. It's practically a synonym for invention itself. What Edison actually did was win, which is not the same thing. Across the ocean, an English chemist named Joseph Swan had been building incandescent lamps for years, and in February 1879, in a lecture hall in Newcastle, he lit a room full of people with a working bulb, nearly a year before Edison's American patent. When Edison later tried to enforce his patent in Britain, the courts pointed at Swan's earlier work and Edison lost. So the two men did the sensible thing and merged their companies into one, selling bulbs under a name that fused them both. Edison's genius was real, but it was the genius of the finished system, the wiring and the marketing and the will to scale, not the lonely spark of first invention. We remember the man who owned the light. We forget the man who already had it lit. Number 22. The cow that was innocent all along. October 1871. Chicago is turning to ash. 300 dead, a third of the city gone, and the public needs someone to blame by morning. They find her fast, Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant, whose cow supposedly kicked over a lantern in her barn and started the whole thing. The image was perfect for the moment, a poor immigrant woman and her clumsy animal, and it followed O'Leary in shame for the rest of her life. It was made up. Decades later, in 1911, a reporter named Michael Ahern admitted flatly that he and two colleagues had invented the cow and lantern detail because it made better copy than the truth. The fire may well have started in or near the O'Leary barn, but the cow, the kicked lantern, the careless immigrant woman, that was newsroom decoration. It was a good line, so they ran it, and a real person wore it like a brand for the rest of her life. She died, some say, partly of the shame of it. In 1997, the Chicago City Council formally passed a resolution exonerating Catherine O'Leary and her cow, more than a century too late for her to hear it. A newsroom needed a villain on deadline, and the cheapest one available was a woman who couldn't fight back. Number 23. The Independence Day that isn't one. Here's a mix-up that half a continent celebrates without quite meaning to. Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. It marks a single event, the Battle of Puebla, on the 5th of May, 1862, when an outnumbered Mexican army beat back a French invasion force. A real and remarkable victory, but a battle, not a birth. Mexico's actual independence came decades earlier, declared on the 16th of September, 1810, with the cry of a priest named Hidalgo in the town of Dolores, and that is the day Mexico itself treats as its national holiday. The confusion largely grew north of the border, where the date got adopted, expanded, and gradually mistaken for the big one. A country's real Independence Day gets quietly outshined by a smaller anniversary wearing its clothes, mostly in a different country. Number 24. The nursery rhyme that isn't about the plague. You were probably told this one as a fun bit of morbid trivia. Ring Around the Rosie is secretly about the Black Death, the rosy rash, the posies to mask the smell, the ashes, everyone falling down dead. It's a great story, endlessly repeated, and folklorists have been rolling their eyes at it for decades. The rhyme doesn't appear in print until the late 1800s, 5 centuries after the plague it supposedly encodes, and the early versions don't even have the lines the theory depends on. The plague reading was grafted onto it much later, probably in the 20th century, by people who found a cheerful children's song more interesting with a mass grave underneath. The scholars who catalogue these rhymes reject the connection cleanly. Sometimes a sing-song is just a sing-song, and the real mystery is our need to bury something dark inside it. Number 25. The witches who were never burned. Everyone knows the Salem witches burned. It's the fixed image, the stake, the flames, the whole hysteria going up in smoke. Open the court records from 1692, and not one of them burned. The court of Oyer and Terminer hanged 19 people. One man, Giles Corey, was slowly crushed to death under stones for refusing to enter a plea. Others died waiting in jail. Terrible, methodical, documented, and not a single burning among them, because burning witches was a continental European practice, not a colonial Massachusetts one. And here's why the small error matters. When you picture the wrong punishment, you file Salem next to lurid medieval fantasy and quietly hold it at arm's length. The paperwork is worse than the myth. These were courtrooms, with judges and warrants and neighbors testifying against neighbors, killing real people by law. We remember the flames that weren't there and forget the signatures that were. Number 26. The machine that was a man. In 1770, a Hungarian inventor named Wolfgang von Kempelen unveiled a wooden figure in a turban, seated at a cabinet, that could play chess. Not badly. It beat Benjamin Franklin. It beat Napoleon, who reportedly tried to cheat and got its pieces swept off the board for his trouble. For decades, it toured Europe and America while brilliant people argued about how a machine could think. Before every game, the owner would open the cabinet doors and swing them wide, showing a dense tangle of gears and clockwork, apparently no room for a person, and the crowd would gasp. Edgar Allan Poe, watching it in America, wrote a whole essay working out that it had to be a hoax, reasoning that a true machine would never lose and this one sometimes did. And he was right, though it took until 1857 to prove it on paper. That year, in an article for the Chess Monthly, the son of the machine's last owner finally explained the trick. A living chess master had been folded into the cabinet the entire time, sliding on a seat, reading the board through magnets, moving the Turk's arm with levers. The great thinking automaton was a very good hiding place. The first machine that ever seemed to have a mind of its own was just a person in the dark, and the real marvel was the carpentry. Number 27. The girl who did it first. The last one is a name you were probably never given, and that's the whole point. You learned that Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery and sparked a movement. What you likely weren't told is that 9 months earlier, on the 2nd of March, 1955, a 15-year-old named Claudette Colvin did exactly the same thing on the same bus system, was handcuffed, dragged off, and arrested. Movement leaders decided, for reasons of age and image, that she couldn't be the face they needed, so history quietly moved past her. But Colvin didn't vanish. She became one of the 4 plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale, the federal case that actually reached the Supreme Court and struck down bus segregation in Alabama by law. And in 2021, a Montgomery court formally expunged the arrest record of that 15-year-old girl, 66 years later. Think about what that means. The last document in her story is the one that finally corrects the record, the paperwork catching up to the truth she'd been carrying alone since she was a teenager. That's the whole game, in one life. So look at what you were holding this morning. A forged deed, a machine that was a man, a president famous for a bathtub, a girl written out of her own courage. None of them was hidden. That's the part that should keep you up a little. Every one of these lies sat in the open, right beside the will, the sketch, the court record, the coin that disproved it, and the true version lost anyway, because the false one was easier to print and easier to love. The document was never the problem, the reading was. 6 centuries ago, a man named Valor ended an empire's oldest claim not with an army, but by reading a forgery closely enough to catch it lying in its own grammar. That's the entire trick, and it still works, and almost nobody does it. Next time, the same game with a sharper edge. 3 world-changing inventions credited to the wrong person, and the patents, in the real inventors' names, that prove it. Until then, do one thing for me. Go back up this list, find the single one you'd have sworn on, the one that just fell over, and defend it in the comments. Name it. Tell me why you believed it. I'll tell you if you're still wrong.